Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today's card has an unlikely duo. I'm using the sheep from this Seamus sheep set by Jane's Doodles. I have this Inky Antics set that I bought for the Smiling Bees. It's called Honey. And then I have this Paper Smooches sentiment set called Courteous Cuties 2. It has a couple of sentiments that combine a sheep and a bee, so I thought, why not? I'm going to start by taking my sheep and stamping it in the lower right-hand corner of a piece of Neenah cardstock, size A2 4¼ by 5½ with some Memento Tuxedo black ink. The next thing I did was measure out my frame. I'm measuring 3/4 of an inch in on the right, the left, and the top. Now I could have done this on my trimmer, I realized later. But anyway, so it's 3/4 of an inch on all sides. For the bottom, this sheep has stick arms, and I didn't want to have to cut around those stick arms, so I put my ruler just above where that arm ended into his body, and that's where I drew my line. Next, I'm going to take my T-square, which is a great handy tool to have, and draw out those lines to the edges so that I can easily cut this inside my trimmer. The trimmer that works best with this is one that has a blade that slides up and down. This is a Fiskars one, and there's actually a wire down the middle where it actually has the cut line. It's not perfect. It's kind of all scrunched up, the wire, and it's a little bit ruined, but it does its job for the most part. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up that line right in the center of my pencil line, and I'm going to move my blade up and down until I get almost to the sheep and then up to the top of that pencil line. And you can see I could have used my trimmer for the 3/4 of an inch because it does measure exactly to 3/4. And I can stop, because I have drawn those lines all the way across, I can easily stop my blade by looking at the center piece of plastic, like the handle on the blade. And when that meets the perpendicular line, that's where I know I need to stop. So I'm going to do this on all sides up to the sheep the best that I can. And this is what's left. So what I'm going to do is take a scissor and I'm going to cut the bulk of it out first so that it's easier to cut around the sheep. And then I'm going to cut the sheep out. Now, the reason why I didn't just cut the sheep and put it on top is because, again, of those stick arms, which would be hard to cut, and also the yarn string would be hard to cut. So I figured I would stamp the sheep so that I would only have to cut the parts that were easy to cut. So I just cut from one side of that rectangle to the other. I felt like this frame needed just a little extra outlining, so I got my black Stampin' Up! Marker out and a ruler, and I'm going to frame the outside of this frame with a black line going all the way up to the sheep. And to make it easy on myself, I'm just going to extend that line out past the frame, and I'm going to extend it in different sizes. So some of these lines will extend far, some not so far. And I was kind of disappointed that my Stampin' Up! Marker is starting to run out of ink, and you know it is when it starts to skip a little bit when you're drawing, and you don't really need it to be skipping while you're drawing a line like this. It's really hard to do. You want to make sure it's a nice solid line. So you can see how the lines are extended out different lengths, and this makes it easy on me because then I don't have to make sure that they're all even, and I also don't have to make sure that the lines meet exactly at the corner. So now I'm going to color my sheep, and I'm just going to use a bunch of dots because I want him to be kind of furry with wool. And I have 4 colors here. I'm going to start with my W1. I'm just drawing a bunch of dots, but I'm leaving some blank in the middle. And now I'm moving W3, so I'm just going darker as I go along. And I'm heavier on the edge, and then I lighten up as I get toward the center. And then I'm going to lighten up even more with the W5. So I'm sort of pushing this color closer to the edge, the darker that I get. And here I am with the W7, and I'm just doing the very, very edge to create some shadow. Now I went back in with my W5 underneath the sheep's neck just to provide a little bit of shadow there, and added a little bit of W3 to blend it. And then finally, I went back in with the W1. I just kind of tapped all over again just to get these dots blending a little bit more so it wouldn't look too much like dots and look more a little bit like furry wool. And I'm going to repeat this process for the top of his head. And actually, the first time I colored this sheep, I used a lighter hand with the darker colors, so I used more W1 and W3 than W5 and W7. I liked it a little bit better. I thought this is a little bit too dark. But in either case, the purpose is to give a little bit of shadow. All right, now I'm going to pull out my lightest and my darkest, and just use my 2 mediums to quickly do the feet and the hands just with those 2 colors. And then for his face, I'm going to reintroduce the 1. So for the face and the ears, I'm going to color the W5 along the entire outside and a little bit on his ears. And then I'll move in with the W3 and move closer to the center. Same with the ears, and then finish off the whole thing with the W1. So his face is going to be a little bit darker than the rest of his body. For the blanket that he's knitting, I'm going to match the colors to the background that I'm going to create inside the frame. So I have a B02, it's kind of a darker blue, and I went over those lines in the stamp with the B02. And now I'm just filling everything in. I'm not really worried about shading. I'm just filling it in with the B000. And then I have a Y11, which is a really light yellow, and I'm just going to draw straight across, and it'll combine with some of the blue, but it's not going to blend everything together, and it'll look like a pattern. And then for the ball, I'm going to have all 3 of my colors. I'll just randomly put some B02 and then fill in the rest with the B000 until it's all colored, and then just draw a few lines with the Y11. I always like to ground my animal so it doesn't look like they're floating. So I'm going to take some G14, it's a light green, I'm going to flick upwards. So what I do is I flick upwards for the grass, and then I add some dots underneath the object that's sitting there. So you could also flick up a little bit in front of the object, but for the most part I just put some dots where they've sort of mushed down the grass that they're standing on or sitting on. And then I went in with a YG09 just for a little variation of color, but I didn't use very much YG09, just a little bit here and there. I have a background piece that's a little bit larger than my frame. I'm just getting it ready here, putting it underneath the sheep panel. And then I'm going to take my B and I'm going to stamp it over both of these pieces. Now I've sort of placed my sentiment to make sure that I get my B in the right spot. So I'm stamping the frame and the background at the same time. And then I've already stamped and cut a post-it so that I can mask over this B while I color the background. So I'm going to place that down. And then I'm going to use my Distress Oxide inks to color the background. I'm going to color a little bit of the cracked pistachio on the bottom, and then I'm going to use some broken china for the top. I'm just making sure I have enough green. And I'm using my round applicators, but they would work pretty much with any applicator you have. And you can see as I'm working here that these are becoming my new go-to ink blending inks, because the regular Distress inks are much more difficult to blend because they soak into the paper and they absorb and become permanent a lot faster than these do. So these sort of stay on top of the paper because they have some pigment ink qualities to them. And so if you get those awful, foam applicator lines, just go over it again and again, and eventually they disappear. And you can see in the close-up photo on the blog post that the blend between the green and the blue is really, really nice. It's a really nice blend. Okay, so I'm going to take off my mask, and it looks like such a cute little bee here. And then I'm going to quickly color him in with 2 of my favorite yellow Copic markers, Y15 all the way around the edges, and then fill in the center with the Y11. So I'm trying to keep to those same colors to match the sheep. And then his wings are a little bit too white, so I took a B00, that same blue I used in the blanket, and I just drew some kind of lines from the bottom to the top of the bee's wings just to give them a little bit of color, like you could see the sky through them. I don't know if you noticed, but the ink sort of faded out my ink that I stamped the bee with, so I just went over those lines with Stampin' Up! Black marker. My sentiment is a little bit too long to fit in the frame, so I'm going to take some surgical tape and cover over where I want it to end. And then I'll take some Hero Arts black ink and ink up the part that I want to stamp. And then I'll remove my surgical tape and then stamp it down up there at the top. And then I'm going to clean my stamp really, really well, test it out on a piece of scratch paper. I covered up the other side and then inked it up and stamped it below the B. So it's an easy way to break up a sentiment. Now I'm going to flip over that sheep panel and cover it with some Scotch foam tape. I'm just going to release the part that's on the top because I'm going to place this over my background and position it based on those B dots to make sure they line up, and then press that down, and then I'll put some tape runner on the back of the B panel and remove that last piece of backing and put it onto a card base. Now, I thought it would be fun to stamp the other B in the set on the inside, and then I just colored it with a Daffodil Delight Stampin' Up! Marker rather than a Copic that might seep through the other side. And that is the card for today. So an interesting couple, but it's so cute with the sentiment. So I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.